This is Alexander, king of Macedonia, and one of the greatest conquerors the world has ever known. He defeated the mighty Persian Empire, marched his armies across deserts and mountains, and dreamed of ruling the world. But in our world, his story ended at the age of just 32, in the palace of Babylon. Yet the gods were not done with him. When Alexander opened his eyes again, it was not in Babylon, nor in Pella, but in a strange and unfamiliar land, Westeros. With him stood the companions who had followed him across the known world, and the soldiers who had fallen in his campaigns, reborn by his side. But here, Alexander owned nothing. No throne, no lands, no empire. His companions despaired. 10 years of endless war, and all their sacrifice, for nothing. But Alexander smiled. To him, this was not defeat, it was destiny. Another world, another chance, another empire to build. In this new world of lords and dragons, rival kings, and hidden daggers, a new name will soon be carved into history. For Alexander, son of Zeus, has returned, and Westeros itself will tremble. Though the gods had brought Alexander and his companions into this strange new land, they carried with them the memories of the world they had left behind. They remembered their triumphs, Essos, Gaugamela, the conquest of Persia. But they also remembered their losses. And some remembered Alexander's cruelty. Parmenion, his most trusted general, could not forget how his son Philotas had been accused of treason and executed by Alexander's command. Soon after, Alexander had ordered Parmenion himself struck down. Yet here, in this new world, they walked side by side once more. But in the shadows of memory, trust was poisoned. For though they fought under the same banner, not all wounds could be forgotten, and some, not forgiven. In a great hall lit by torchlight, Alexander gathered his companions. 3 men were brought before them, speaking of strange lands beyond the sea. They told of Braavos, the greatest power on this side of the narrow sea. They spoke of the Vale, with its fortress at the Eyrie, and of King's Landing, the heart of Westeros itself. The companions listened closely, for though this world was new, the names and places felt as if they had always known them. Here they debated their course. To strike directly at Westeros would be bold, but unwise. Better first to secure a foothold. Braavos, rich and powerful, yet within reach. Once Braavos were subdued, the Macedonian army could sail across the sea, take the Vale as their first step into Westeros, and from there march south to seize King's Landing itself. The companions agreed, and the king gave his blessing. With that, the die was cast. Maps were spread, orders given, and the Macedonian machine began to move again. This time toward Braavos, and then toward King's Landing. But even Alexander knew an army does not march on dreams and ambition alone. His men needed food, laborers, and resources to sustain the campaign. Scouts reported that the village of Sestadime, lying just beyond Braavosi influence, was rich in grain and cattle. Alexander gave the order. At dawn, the Macedonians descended upon Sestadime. Archers loosed burning arrows into the skies, the phalanx advanced in perfect formation, and cavalry rode down fleeing villagers. By nightfall, the village was aflame. Stores of grain were seized, workers pressed into service, and the army replenished. But the raid did not go unnoticed. Within days, the declaration came: Braavos was at war. Now that war had been declared, Alexander wasted no time. He immediately marched on the nearest stronghold to Sestadime, the castle of Ixakeria, a fortress only 2 days' ride from Braavos itself. Alexander knew his numbers were limited. A direct assault would cost him dearly. Instead, he chose patience. The Macedonians cut the roads, seized the wells, and waited. Days turned to weeks, the defenders grew hungry, and morale crumbled. At last, without a single clash of blades, the gates of Ixakeria were thrown open. The garrison surrendered. The castle, and its stores, were now his. With this first true conquest in the New World, Alexander was ready to take a step that would echo across continents. Standing within the captured halls of Ixakeria, he proclaimed the birth of a new state, the Kingdom of Macedonia. Ravens were sent to every corner of Essos and Westeros, carrying the message. A foreign king had come, a conqueror reborn, and he had claimed land as his own. The world of ice and fire had taken notice. Alexander knew he did not yet have the men to storm the great city of Braavos directly. To bring the Braavosi to battle, he would need to lure them out from behind their walls. So the Macedonians turned to fire and fear. Village after village was put to the torch. The nobles could not ignore it. If their villages and castles fell one by one, the people would soon turn against them. And so, under mounting pressure, the Braavosi rallied every able man they could muster and marched out to meet the invader. The two armies clashed near the village of Samotha. For the first time in this strange new world, Alexander would face his enemies not from behind walls or in ambush, but in open battle, the kind of contest where his genius had always shone brightest. The stage was set. Alexander's first great battle in Westeros was about to begin. The plain of Samotha was heavy with expectation. Across the field, two armies prepared for their first clash in this new world. In the center of the Macedonian line stood the phalanx, the unbreakable wall of pikes that had carried Alexander from Greece to Persia. Guarding their flanks were the hyperspists, elite veterans ready to move where the line was weakest. On the left wing, under the command of Parmenion, rode the Thessalian cavalry, famed for their discipline and endurance. On the right, Alexander himself led the companion cavalry, the shock force of his army, drilled to follow him wherever he struck. Opposite them, the Braavosi army arrayed for battle. In their center stood their heavy infantry, city-trained and armored. Behind them waited a great line of archers, bows and crossbows ready to darken the sky with missiles. On their flanks, their cavalry stood ready, not as seasoned as the Macedonians, but determined to defend their homeland. Two armies, two ways of war, stood face to face. The silence stretched until the first horn sounded and the Battle of Samotha began. The cavalry wings surged forward. On the Macedonian right, Alexander himself thundered at the head of the companion cavalry, while on the left, Parmenion led the Thessalians against the Braavosi horse. Eager to unleash their greatest strength, the Braavosi archers advanced ahead of the line and moved into missile range of the Macedonian center. A deadly storm of arrows followed. At once, the commanders of the phalanx realized their mistake. These were no ordinary bowmen. The weapons of Braavos were the equal of the English longbow from our world. Their shafts powerful enough to pierce armor, their range far greater than anything the Macedonians had faced in their world. Men fell by the dozens, their ranks torn apart by the rain of arrows. If they remained still, the phalanx would be annihilated before it ever reached the enemy. And so, the order was given, advance. The archers, seeing the spears closing in, fell back behind their infantry. With a thunderous crash, pike met shield, and the battle was joined in the center. The infantry on the flanks of the phalanx were exposed, and the Braavosi archers rained death upon them. Slowly, the Macedonian center began to bend. The phalanx, though still holding, was bleeding and faltering. Just as it seemed the Macedonian center would collapse, salvation came thundering across the field. On the wings, Alexander and Parmenion had at last broken the Braavosi cavalry. The Thessalians and companions wheeled inward, bearing down on the exposed archers. The horsemen fell upon them with merciless fury. The bowmen were helpless in close combat. They were cut down without mercy, their ranks shattered in moments. Then, with the archers destroyed, Alexander turned his companions once more. Now the trap was complete. The Braavosi center, already locked against the advancing phalanx, found themselves surrounded. With no room to maneuver and no hope of escape, they fought where they stood, until the last resistance was crushed. On that field near Samotha, Alexander had won his first great victory in this strange new land. Though Alexander had won a decisive victory, the price was steep. His army bore the scars of the Braavosi archers. Nearly 300 Macedonians lay dead, most of them from the phalanx in the center. The Braavosi, however, suffered utter ruin. Their army was destroyed, with nearly 900 slain on the field. Only a scattered few managed to flee back toward Braavos, carrying grim tidings of defeat. Alexander's men had proven once again their discipline and courage, but the battle was a harsh lesson. This new world held dangers unlike any they had known. That night in the Macedonian camp, inside Alexander's command tent, him and his generals met. Though victory had been won against the Braavosi, it had come at a heavy price. 300 Macedonians had fallen. The men celebrated their triumph, but among the companions, there was little joy. Parmenion was furious. He made his frustration known, that the army had bled too much for too little, that Alexander's recklessness had cost them dearly. To him, 300 veterans lost in a foreign land was no victory worth celebrating. Others, however, sought solutions. It was then that Ptolemy spoke of the Dothraki, fierce riders to the east, unmatched in speed and ferocity. Their strength on horseback could replace the losses Macedonia had suffered, and perhaps give the army an edge this new world had never seen. The idea intrigued Alexander deeply. The Dothraki were famed across Essos, yet never in history had they crossed the narrow sea. To bring them into Westeros under his banner would not only bolster his army but also etch his name into legend as the first conqueror to lead the horselords across the waters. Alexander agreed. Orders were given. Craterus was tasked with riding to Exarcheria to gather supplies and begin recruiting men from the surrounding villages. These locals would be trained in the Macedonian way. Ptolemy was tasked with riding east to attempt to recruit the Dothraki. But Alexander himself would not wait. With Hephaestion and Parmenion at his side, he marched the main host north, toward Braavos. Unlike Exarcheria, this would not be a minor fortress. This was the city itself, rich, proud, and fiercely defended. The march to the city took several days. Along the way, Craterus returned, bringing with him 600 new recruits gathered from the surrounding lands. When at last the Macedonians reached the walls of Braavos, Alexander wasted no time. Siege lines were drawn, camps constructed, and watchtowers raised. The greatest city of the free cities, long thought unassailable, was now under the shadow of the Macedonian war machine. The siege of Braavos had begun. Against the towering walls of the richest of the free cities, Alexander's army wheeled forth 2 siege towers and a massive battering ram. Disaster struck first. One of the siege towers was caught by a well-aimed shot from the Braavosi catapults. The machine splintered under the impact, collapsing in flames. Yet the assault did not falter. The second tower, battered but intact, reached the defenses. Soldiers climbed its ladders, shields raised against arrows, to clash with the defenders at the parapets. At the same time, the great ram thundered against the city's gate. Macedonian phalanxes surged through, forcing their way into the narrow streets of the city. Fighting spilled into alleys and marketplaces, the disciplined Macedonians slowly pushing the defenders back step by step. The Braavosi commanders, forced to reinforce the collapsing gate, weakened their hold upon the walls. This proved a fatal mistake. From the surviving tower, Macedonian soldiers poured onto the ramparts, cutting down the defenders and sweeping the battlements clean. By the day's end, the Braavosi garrison lay slaughtered to the last man. The gates of Braavos stood open, and the city had fallen. Yet Alexander showed restraint. No plunder was ordered, no slaughter of civilians permitted. For he knew Braavos would serve as his foothold, a harbor from which the Macedonian fleet could one day carry war across the narrow sea. With their capital lost and their ruler taken captive in the siege, the will of the Braavosi was broken. One by one, the remaining strongholds surrendered, and the proud kingdom of Braavos bent the knee to Alexander. In a single campaign, he had conquered the richest and greatest province in all of Essos. Letters of recognition arrived from Volantis, from Carth, and from other great cities, all acknowledging the rise of a new power across the narrow sea. To mark this triumph, Alexander remade the land in his own image. Braavos itself was renamed New Pella, in honor of the city where he had been born. The nearby city of Rhyros he renamed Alexandria, as the first of many to bear his name in this world. But victory was only the beginning. The Macedonian king turned his eyes westward, toward Westeros. And so, as new soldiers were recruited and drilled in the Macedonian way, word spread across both continents. Alexander had come, and his next war would be for the Iron Throne itself.